Metropolitan Community Churches, which is the largest queer organization of any kind, where churches in 16 countries around the world. MCC New York has a long history of leadership in human rights and social justice movements, and a particular commitment to meeting the needs of New York City's hungry, which is a segue. The next reverend I'd like to ask to come up, Reverend Barry Signorelli, who is from the Church of the Holy Apostles, who is one of the entities tonight who has given us this space. And people should realize that in addition to being nice enough to allowing us to have Friday night services at Congregation Best in Pastora, this space, Monday through Friday at lunchtime, has round tables and over 1,100 homeless people come here and have free lunches. And if anyone is interested in participating in volunteering, you can just call up the Church of the Holy Apostles or speak to someone after tonight's program. And can the four people who are going to light the candles come?
We pause to remember those past generations of gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender people who lost their lives due to bigotry, hatred and ignorance. May the memories of those whom we lovingly recall tonight inspire us to be ourselves and lead lives worth remembering. Our thoughts turn to those who were murdered, those martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked and whose names are no longer known. As we remember them, let us meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death.
We promise tonight in the words of Ruth, even death shall not part us from them. Their names are established over our inheritance from them. The names of the dead shall not be cut off from among us. In every generation, people have murdered God's children because they were deemed different. Throughout history, we have suffered in fear and silence as gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender people were beaten, murdered, or succumbed to their own weakness. The time has come for us to change the future by remembering and memorializing these deaths with proper respect.
Doesn't God plant in us some little bit of the divine outrage at seeing injustice and oppression, just as God did for the prophets of the Bible? Isn't our feeling of outrage a reflection of what God feels in seeing the suffering of God's own creatures? Let us take a moment in our collective silence to think of those who died because of their sexuality or gender, and pray for the time when society will appreciate all of God's children.
Please be seated. Three years ago, we were discussing that in the United States, there were no memorials for all those people who were persecuted or died because they were homosexual during the Nazi era. So we started a competition. Thanks to the internet, we got several submissions, and it was narrowed down to 3 finalists: Peter Harvey, Bruce Eves, and Noreen Dean Dresser. And at last year's Dr. Magnus Hirschberg program, we had the artists come in and discuss their artwork. And in the August meeting of the Board of Directors of the Congregation Bethesda Pastora, one of the artists and her work was selected to be the memorial that will hang in Congregation Bethesda Pastora as one of the first memorials for the persecution of what happened to the homosexual community during the Third Reich. And the artwork is here in front of you, and at the end of the service, I invite all of you to come and take a look at it. On the back of the program, you'll also see a website. And tonight's program is on the website, and any means of communicating in the future, please feel free to use that. The brochures that were handed out that you have were supposed to have a photograph inserted of the artwork. And again, this is our first annual Memorial Day. The printer didn't deliver them. But if you leave your name on the back of the sign-in sheet, Dean will be pleased to send you one of the photographs, or you can download it from the internet. So what I would like to do now is to call up Noreen Dean Dresser and ask her to describe and talk about the memorial.
It's a very interesting idea. There are going to be historians who are going to talk about and do it probably better than I could in a more precise manner. The 5 to 6 years of research that I did and far extended much more in depth than that of the historical accounting of the fascist era in Germany and what that meant for the gay and lesbian community that lived there. What I would like to share with you is something about what is by the process of the aesthetic dimension we get into, which is I'm really asking you to look at the process of memory itself, what your life means now, and what it is to remember those that have gone, who have lived lives before us, because to remember the past and envision the future is a very particular dimension of what it means to be a human being. There has been, in 1992, what started me on this process that led to this memorial was Pat Buchanan gave a speech at the Republican Convention that was given free airtime across this country. And in that speech, he was calling for the arrest and, aggressively describing his disapproval of homosexuals and the dangers of AIDS and so on and so forth. When I was watching that program, 2 things lit up in my mind. One being, of course, that we fought a war against those kinds of ideas. And the second thing was that he was representing to me the part of the long racial history that is embedded in this country. Because if you look at our 19th century, this country's Western policy often records in the congressional record movements of destruction and genocide to whole peoples as we expanded across the West. And cultures were expended. And having come through the 60s that you all have in this room, and the terrible pain of what that was about, of America having to confront itself, it was very, very important that we look again, because it seemed target group, the thing that had juice, the thing that had heat, was the question of homosexuality, especially for young men, who often who are uncertain and given a cause when they're motivated to violence. Anyway, that was what started me, and I went to the Simon Wiesenthal Library, and really, in a sense, quite, in a sense, innocent. They were very generous with me and did a direct reading list for a year and a half. And I started to sink down into the mire of what would be records of torture that I'm sure have been duplicated and learned from, records of medical experiments, records of racial theory that suggested that was more than just propaganda, that became actual tools for the motherhood pin and other such nonsense, that reached into a society and tore it asunder and destroyed its common bonds of humanity. And having done that, I then went through the gay and lesbian archives. In '92, very little was written on homosexuals, right, being recorded. And the Holocaust Museum in Washington was starting to fund scholarship, which was very, very important. Things were starting to come forward. So anyway, in that time, over the next 5 years, I visited 4 concentration laggers, holding tanks, walked the soil, met many, many gay and lesbian Germans who were very generous with me about talking about their past and a very complicated history. And in that process, I completed in 1997 a whole series of 23 pieces on queer memorial memory in Nazi Germany. Following that show, I then thought about for a full year about how to bring that into a culmination, what my lessons would be. And that resulted in the Memorial Exhibit 9. Because, you should also recognize that for Congregation Beth Torah to open itself to a memorial of gay and lesbian people is also to be one of the most profoundest lessons we can learn out of the Holocaust experience. Because in each one of those camps you go to, people who wore badges were separated from each other. Men and women were separated from each other. Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, political prisoners, gays and lesbians, basically gay men in the concentration camps, political, asocial women. They had a large badge system that kept each group pitted against each other and counted on a competition almost to hold a kind of fear in place that allowed the camp system to work. It was one of the ways they were able to enable themselves to have so many thousands of people in overcrowded circumstances in the desperation of their lives. And for me, one of the profoundest lessons this teaches us is that we have a duty to be in community. And the duty to be in community means not necessarily, pulls against what we now live in a society where we're over individually, where greed is good, to quote the Wall Street movie in the 80s. And we want to judge people by being famous rather than the contents of their character. So when I did this piece, what I wanted to do was to recognize also that if everything from my comment forward, that the central piece of the racist ideology of Nazi Germany spun on an ancient and long-extended history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism that became entwined in racial theory in the late 19th century. And he moved that forward as a central piece so that Jews were eradicated at the lowest level of the camps, and that other groups, therefore, were designated as, for other reasons, failing the biological superiority of building on what was to be the 1,000 years of right. And so to hold that kind of respect, I wanted to make sure that we envision ourselves as gays and lesbians in perspective to the other communities that died with us, suffered with us, and were targeted. So if you look at the peace, of course, I wanted also to expand that we should not let those who hate us define us. That we always have to do the interior work to bring ourselves, to keep coming back to ourselves, a feeling of wholeness, and to try to heal each other so that we do not let those who hate us to define us or become the definers of our identity. So I took the yellow badge system and transformed it as God intended it to be, in that kind of beautiful golden clouds that I'm sure all of you have seen. And opening up that space, I then wanted to take the pink edge of light from the badge system and have that be a separator from the blue-black velvetness of the expanse in which we all find ourselves at home in this cosmos. And beneath that, then, we will find a very concrete, very particular pine box. That pine box has often been a symbol of graves and burial names across the planet by many peoples. And using that rather simple reference, I embedded on the border of it is what happens at a gravesite. When you go to bury someone, there's a gradation of soil off to create the hole, the expanse in which somebody's body is lowered into the oblivion, which is death. And so I wanted to have that, and that soil is from Sachsenhausen, Auschwitz, and from Jerusalem. Embedded also are all different kinds of objects that were used to kill particular gay men and the means of doing that. So many were killed by injection. It was one of the means of it. 14 boys at Auschwitz still cold. They were thrown into barracks with older men. And then 4 days later, the SS drummed up charges of homosexual activity because the boys slept with the men. Probably because it was cold and freezing and there was no room and the filth of them. And they ran them up on charges of homosexuality and injected them. That was just, and then the medical experiments, the Sachsenhausen. The other instruments, of course, this is a piece of coal. There's other things that were used that tell particular stories or are part of the spin of particular stories and particular lives. At the bottom of that, I did not use in any of my pieces any references to the degraded human bodies and the kind of massive suffering that went on. Because I think we should always, people who were in those camps were not there by their choice. And we must remember also, I think, that while we would love to make everybody a hero, the truth is, I think, one of the harder lessons to learn is that these were just everyday folks. And some were noble and some were not. Some were prejudiced, some were not. They lived in the society they lived in, they shared the ideas and the conversations of those times. So, but what was really, really touching is that nobody has a right to take the days of life of someone else. That death is surely and should remain in God's hands. And so, in light of that, I wanted to simply leave a sky at the bottom of the grave sites for the covering over the days of the lives of people who were wretched on this earth before their time and without their consent. And also to hold that reality as a lesson inside, as I said, the cosmos, so that we always keep a perception as we look at the piece, and hopefully it will draw you into reflection, that you have the ability to stand in front of that knowing both realities is true. As in Kosovo, we're seeing now more as an example. That each generation has to wrestle with these forces. That we have to choose to give up any kind of bigotry that we ourselves were educated to. And that we have to take on the hard work of transforming our inner life as well as our outer life. And if I you and everyone else is in a safer space.
Our borough president, CBST Fields, has been gracious enough to come in person to join us. I'd like to invite you up to this one.
Good evening. I am indeed delighted to be a co-sponsor and participant in this first annual Memorial Day for the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community. I'm certainly thrilled to be able to work with Congregation Des Subject Torah, International Association of Lesbian and Gay Children of Holocaust Survivors, and the Church of the Holy Apostles, as well as so many dedicated co-sponsors. I would especially like to thank Rick Landman, who has worked so very hard to put this event together tonight, along with so many others of you, and who reached out to me to invite me to participate. I very much appreciate that. We joined together because we recognize that violence against the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities remains a very serious problem. We join together today because we know that it is imperative that we remember the history behind those attacks and ensure that we never allow events like the Holocaust to ever happen again. The systemic persecution against gay men and lesbians under the Nazi regime and the destruction of the renowned Institute of Sexual Sciences led by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld in 1933 set back the movement for sexual equality decades. Only with the organizing of the Manichaean organization, the Daughters of Belias, and the subsequent Stonewall Rebellion, the 30th anniversary of which we celebrate this year, did the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community find a chance to reassert itself and achieve equality. It is therefore fitting that this Memorial Day commemorates the loss of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender lives through killings, beatings, and suicides throughout history, and important that we recognize that violence against people as a result of their sexual orientation, their race, sex, creed, national origin, and religion continues to plague society today. As we witness acts of violence such as that perpetuated against James Byrd in Jasper, Texas, against Matthew Shepard in Wyoming, against Billy Jack Gaither in Alabama, and countless other victims, it is imperative that we all stand together to combat this rash of hate crimes. It is imperative that when Black people are attacked, that gay and lesbian people speak up. It is imperative that when gay and lesbian people are attacked, that Black people speak out. We must condemn all of these acts together, regardless of what community is being victimized, or else we allow such violence to divide and diminish us. I pledge myself and the resources of the Office of the Manhattan Borough President to continuing to work for the passage of the Hate Crimes Bill in Albany, and to work with the Anti-Violence Project and other concerned activists and citizens and organizations, with all people of good conscience, to fight back against hatred, to promote a spirit of unity and tolerance for all people. My Manhattan is a borough in which we all learn to live together
before Dirk leaves, I want a copy of that if you can email it and get it on the website. Thank you. All right. Many of you saw the movie The Celluloid Closet or Times of Harvey Milk. I just want to make an announcement, and I'm reading from their publicist. The Academy Award-winning team of Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman, who made the films The Celluloid Closet, Common Threads, and Story from the Quilt, and The Times of Harvey Milk, have been working on a new project which is called Paragraph 175. This is to be a new documentary about the experience of homosexuals during the Nazi era. The film is scheduled to be completed in the early summer and for broadcast on Channel 4 in the United Kingdom and on HBO Cinemax in the United States. Strategic planning for distribution and exhibition is currently underway and will be likely to begin a series of international film festival screenings at the end of the year. And if people want to again follow up on this, it'll be on the website www.infotru.com. I also just want to give a status update. The city of New York in Brooklyn, funded by taxpayer money, $700,000, has a Holocaust memorial in Sheepshead Bay. When it was built in 1996, we requested that part of the memorial tell the story of what happened to the homosexual community. It is now almost 4 years, we are getting close, and I've actually waited till after I hear Professor Cloud's talk tonight before we get the exact wording, but it does look like we will be able to have a concrete monument in New York City that will tell the story and be devoted to the homosexuals, and I'm also working with the disabled rights advocates, so they will be getting in there too. When I went to school, I never learned anything about gay history. I never learned anything about what happened to gay people in any generation, my own or in the past. So why I think it's so important that we take part of Memorial Day to add an educational component is if we don't understand and know our own history, no one else will. And if we don't create a forum where people want to listen and read and learn, people aren't going to want to do the research and write and study the topic. So I am very pleased and honored that Professor John Fout of Bard College said pro bono that he would come here tonight to be the key speaker to explain from his latest research what did happen during the Third Reich to the homosexual community. Not the myths, but the facts. And I call you up to the stage, with one caveat. When the congressman comes, we're going to have to stop and get a national proclamation. So, John Fout.
Good evening. Can you hear me in the back? Raise your hand if you cannot. My research is based on almost 12 years of archival research in Germany, and I've read hundreds of documents of a variety of kind, but especially my research is focused on court cases. Homosexual men were tried by civilian courts and military courts, special police courts, and what the Nazis called Sondergerichte, special courts. So as you can imagine, it's a very complex legal history. What we have known about the fate of homosexuals in the Third Reich has unfortunately been based on a relative handful of survivor testimonies. Unlike the huge body, however, of Jewish survivor testimonies about their experiences in Nazi Germany. So many homosexual men seem to have been so traumatized, those who survived, by the experience that it is a remarkable that we have so little material upon which to base our knowledge of what happened to them. However, we have very thorough Nazi bureaucrats, and in trying gay men in the courts of Nazi Germany, incredible records were collected by policemen, prosecutors, judges, and a host of other officials. Police stenographers were used to take down the testimony and interrogation of the men who were brought before the police and the courts. And thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these records, houses and in archives across Germany. My work is the first to examine a huge number of these cases, 1,500 in all that I have read every summer and every winter break in Germany over the last 10 years. I'll perhaps leave to the question phase, the period after my talk, if additional questions would be raised about this material. But what is important is perhaps it represents the largest body of autobiographical material on gay men in the 20th century, and perhaps in the modern world. Not only do we have the testimony, we have the trial records, the judgment of the court, records of their imprisonment, and in many instances the fate of them during World War II and in the years after. Moreover, these police bureaucrats collected huge amounts of personal information on the men: age, occupation, residence, military military and school records, and a host of documents are to be found in these remarkable files. And so it is possible to not only recount the history of the prosecution and persecution of homosexuals through these court records, it's possible to recreate, to some considerable extent, the personal lives of these men. Tonight, I can only focus on part of the story. I am focusing on the actual persecution, what happened to the men. In my, what is actually a 2-volume work, which will be published by Columbia University Press in their gay series, I'm doing a volume on the fate of men in the German military, in the Wehrmacht in World War II, and a separate volume on the civilian prosecutions. Although I can't here talk very much about the lives of individual men, I will do so extensively in these 2 volumes, so that we do not have a history of the persecutors, but rather what I will try to do in these 2 volumes is tell a great deal about the lives of the men who suffered under the Nazis. But I would like to begin with the story of one man. It was ironically and interestingly the first case that I discovered. In East Germany, the summer the wall came down. I had gone to Dresden to do some work on actually the imperial period in German history, and was looking for court records on what happened to homosexuals in the 1890s during the time that Magnus Hirschfeld founded the first World's Gay Rights Organization. The archivist told me that, as was the case in many archives, most of the older records had been lost, but they had a few records from the Nazi period that survived that were in the archives. And so the first case I read was about Eric. Eric was 29 years old. He had served in the military, the Wehrmacht, from 35 to 38, and then again from 40 to 42. He had already been persecuted by the Nazi state in that he had been forcibly sterilized because he was regarded as slightly mentally retarded, although he held a job and worked his entire life. But he also was suffering from epilepsy, and that too was probably a factor in his sterilization. So he was having medical problems, he was released from the Wehrmacht, and he took a job in a small town south of Dresden, where he had lived most of his life. And he was working alongside Russian prisoners of war. And he decided to have sex with one of those Russian prisoners of war. And the Russian reported him, and he was arrested and taken to prison and brought under the auspices of the Gestapo, because he also broken the law against relations with a non-German, a law normally used against women. For some reason, Eric decided to confess to the police his entire sexual life. He had never, however, had a criminal record, had never been arrested. And that made the story even more interesting. It seems that he came out as a young gay man in the fateful year of 1933. And between 1933 and January 1943, he had had sex with 35 men whose names he could remember, and many other men, including men with whom he had served in the military. He even had sex on army bases. He also had sex with most of the men in the town. Yet he had never gone to Dresden, he had never been in a gay bar, so he had not been socialized in any way into a gay subculture in any of the urban areas of Germany, as so many gay men were. He was also living with a woman who was 49 years old. She was questioned about their sexual life, and she got very nervous when she was questioned by the police, but emphasized that since she had been married before, she knew what normal sex was, and that she was having normal sex with Eric. So I guess that makes Eric bisexual, but I'm not sure. He certainly spent most of his young adult life having sex with men. He was found guilty. He was given a 3-year prison sentence, and then upon completion of that prison sentence, he was to be put in permanent preventative detention, which meant surely a concentration camp. After he was sent to prison, perhaps in the confusion of bombings and the difficulties of war, he escaped. And so there is a kind of happy ending to the story in that sense. In that as late as 1948, the police in Dresden were still looking for him. Now his story raised all kinds of questions for me. Though I've been teaching gay history at Bard College since the 70s and was a German historian, I, like most of us, did not know for sure what had been the fate of gay men in Nazi Germany. Women were not criminalized, or lesbian sex was not criminalized under the law, and so very few women came before the courts. But it was interesting to me that he had been having such a remarkably active sex life during the first 10 years of the Nazi regime. He had never been reported. He had nonetheless never gone to Dresden, never went to a gay bar, didn't have the vocabulary to discuss sexuality and homosexuality, didn't even understand much of the medicalized language. And, of course, he introduced me to the lives of rural men and men in small towns, a very different, very unusual world. Very unknown in the sense that most gay history has largely told the history of middle-class gay men and some lesbian women. We know very little about the lives of working-class homosexuals. So I was fascinated that he survived, I was fascinated that he didn't go to a concentration camp, although he might have. I was fascinated that he was able to have such an active sex life through almost the entire Nazi period. I was fascinated by class differences and his experiences as a young man in a rural, small-town world. And I began to search for documents to further my inquiry into court records. And so here I stand 10 years later almost, and I want to share with you some of my most important findings. Obviously, I began with the question, was there a gay Holocaust? The answer is no. Was there incredible persecution of homosexuals, primarily homosexual men, in Nazi Germany? Absolutely. Did thousands of men end up in concentration camps? Yes. Did thousands of men die? Yes. But the story is far more complex than I had ever imagined. And I want to try to share some of those complexities with you. In looking at the Nazi period, I have divided it essentially into 3 periods. But before I begin the first phase, let me quickly say something about late Imperial Germany and Weimar Germany. In the late Imperial period, in a country of about 70 million people, a relative handful of men, as is the case in much of Western culture, a relative handful of men were sentenced to prison every year for homosexuality, about 600 a year. Most of those men were working class. They mostly had sex in public places. Middle-class men could afford the luxury of privacy. Nor was there any serious, systematic attempt to root out or to uncover the hidden world of middle and upper-class homosexuals. The same is true largely in the history of the United States. And thank you. So about 600 men a year were found guilty. They served short prison terms. Some were given monetary fines. Generally, prison terms lasted a few weeks or a few months, except those men who had sex with minors. The law could allow courts to send men to prison for having sex with other men and for animals, and there were a considerable number of bestiality cases, up to 5 years. During World War I, prosecution essentially ceased. This is in remarkable contrast to World War II. Of course, in late Imperial Germany, as I already mentioned, and as we're celebrating today, Magnus Hirschfeld had founded one of the 2 gay rights groups in Imperial Germany. And then at the end of the war, in 1990, after the Versailles Treaty, and into the early 20s, a group of veterans founded an organization called the League for Human Rights, the Bund für Menschenrecht. And this organization far surpassed the size of Magnus Hirschfeld's, and the organization in the mid-20s, before the Depression, claimed a membership of 50,000 men. Remarkable, men and women, excuse me. A remarkable first mass gay rights organization in the world. The number of prosecutions in the late Weimar period began to rise slightly, especially with more right-wing but not Nazi governments. And in the late years of the Weimar Republic, about 1,000 men a year were convicted under the German sodomy law, paragraph 175. Often a slang name for a homosexual was a 175er. The German word, of course, for gay is schwul. So now we arrive in 1933. Hitler is named Chancellor at the end of January of that year, and over the next 6 months establishes his totalitarian regime. In this first phase, as I call it, between 33 and 36, a number of important developments began to change the approach by the courts to homosexuals. First, as was the case with the treatment of Jews, some gay bars and all political organizations were shut down in 1933. However, what I've discovered, and some other more recent work has also discovered, is that the gay community continued to survive despite the prosecution and persecution in the Nazi period. So in all large cities in 1945, there are still gay bars and gay bathhouses. So the Nazi period is remarkably contradictory, and it's very difficult to understand the pattern of prosecution. In late 1933, the Nazis, in the process of criminalizing society, instituted powerful new laws to be used against criminals in society. They included the power to declare people habitual offenders and put them in permanent preventative detention. It gave the courts power to castrate sex offenders. It gave the courts powers to send them or put them in long penitentiary terms. The Germans differentiated between a prison and a penitentiary term. It would take a long explanation, but penitentiary was the most severe punishment. It meant loss of civil rights as well. And these laws, these Nazi laws, will be used against a variety of groups and individuals in German society throughout the entire Nazi period. The number of prosecutions began to rise steadily, and by 1936, what I call the end of the first phase in the persecution of homosexuals, there were now 5,000 convictions a year. So the number of convictions from the late imperial period has risen fivefold. A very important development came in 1934 when Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA, was killed, assassinated by Adolf Hitler, because the SA posed a threat to Hitler's power. And then and only then did Hitler out Ernst Röhm, although everybody knew Ernst Röhm was gay, as did Hitler. And Röhm had even written about homosexuality in the late 1920s. Then two crucial developments came in 1935. First, the Nazis revised the law dealing with male homosexuality. And what they did is they created a category, a law called 175A, which now allowed the courts to send homosexuals to penitentiaries, not prisons. It was a 5-year prison term under 175. To penitentiaries for up to 10 years. And of course, all the other laws were applicable, including permanent preventative detention and castration. 4 categories of offenders were established in the revised Nazi law, which stayed on the books in West Germany until 1969, even though it was challenged before the German Supreme Court, West German Supreme Court, in the 1950s. Those categories were: 1, men who raped other men; 2, men who had sex with subordinates, teachers who had sex with students, officers who had sex with men under their command, whatever. Thirdly, men who had sex with minors. And fourthly, male prostitutes, or male prostitution. So now, a second category, or second method, weapon is created to go after what is a minority of men within the larger homosexual community. Moreover, the German sodomy law, which came into being in 1871 when Germany was united, had been challenged in the Imperial and Weimar period before the German Supreme Court. And so the German Supreme Court had to define what sodomy was, and using sort of heterosexist terms, decided that sodomy was sex involving intercourse-like motions. In other words, anal or oral sex. Masturbation would not be criminalized under the law. You actually have a situation where some homosexual men would masturbate each other to avoid prosecution, unless, of course, they did it in public, and then they could be charged with public indecency. Well, there was a group of middle-class homosexuals in the city of Weimar, city of Goethe and Schiller, who were charged in 1935. And the judge, in his decision, sent a whole range of men, a number of men to prison, including a number of men who had masturbated only. And he said to the men in his decision, this is now National Socialist law. What you've done is a heinous crime. You must be punished for it. I'm sending you to prison. So the men, middle-class men with lawyers, challenged the decision and went before the German Supreme Court yet again. And it was upheld by the German Supreme Court in 1935 as well, the very year that the law was expanded. The judge, or the Supreme Court, said that not only was masturbation a crime, a heinous crime, but any touching of another person's body with a lustful intent could lead to imprisonment. Now the courts had unlimited power as a result of the new law and the court decision to, in a sense, find any man guilty who had any kind of sexual contact or even touched another man. Finally, in 1936, as we sort of end what I call the first phase, the years of preparation for far more extensive persecution in the later years, the German government established a special clearinghouse and legal police organization to track homosexuals all across Germany and to track abortions. It's an interesting combination. And so for the first time, there have often been, and the whole history of homophobia is always the most horrible when there is state-sponsored persecution. This is the first instance when such a highly organized central government organization was established to track homosexuals. But in addition, special SS units were dispatched in the summer of 1936 to inaugurate what I call Phase 2 of Nazi persecution, the years of systematic persecution. These special units were sent to large cities to help local police in ferreting out homosexuals. And then, following that, into 1937, under Himmler's leadership, the entire German police was reorganized, and special units, commissariats, were established in all police departments across Germany to deal only with ferreting out homosexuals. And so now, in this beginning of this second phase, the powerful instruments of Nazi injustice, the laws and the courts and the police, were combined with special units where very knowledgeable men, or men who became very knowledgeable of the gay community, and actually their reports are often very insightful and wonderful for us historians. But it launched a new phase, and it is a unique phase in all modern Western culture, as is the third phase, the killing years in World War II. But this second phase inaugurated a period when the police abandoned the traditional passive approach and that only went after men who had sex in public, to a new model where every suspect who is arrested is forced to tell the police every sexual partner with whom he's ever had sex. And then each of those individuals are pursued, arrested, and files are established on them. And an ever-widening circle of men are brought into this new police network and new police system. They also used photographs and a whole range of interesting methods that I have no time to go into here. But what's terribly important is that the class nature of the prosecution changes. If generally across Western culture, sodomy laws are primarily fall on the backs of the working classes and individuals who have sex in public places, the new approach, systematic prosecution of as many homosexuals as the police could uncover, meant that large numbers of middle class and professional people are for the first time being arrested and sent to jail. And this is the period more than any other when homosexuals across Germany feared the knock at the door, when the police or the Gestapo would arrive. And of course, the impact fell especially hard on middle-class people, educated men, men who held professional positions, government jobs, because if you were a medical doctor, for example, you would lose your medical license, you would be kicked out of your medical association, and your university would take away your doctor's degree. Of all the professional people, the largest category of professional men were dentists. Don't ask me why there were so many gay dentists in Nazi Germany, but as a middle-class professional group, they're overrepresented. And but of course, what was really also important is that the prison terms began to rise dramatically. So if you might have been sent to prison for a few weeks or a few months in the Weimar Republic, or even given a monetary fine if it was your first violation, now, if you were convicted under 175, the old law, which still criminalized sex between consenting adults, you could still, you went to prison or you were sent to prison for up to 48 months, generally. Prison terms ranged in the late 30s from 12 to 48 months. Those men, thousands and thousands of them, who had been convicted either in the Weimar period or now in the peacetime years of the Nazi era, after serving their prison term, were released and were eligible for military service. So it's so remarkable that the current debate over gays in the military had a unique turn in Nazi Germany. So when the war broke out in 1939, late 1939, there were some 50,000 men who had been convicted in the late imperial period, the Weimar period, or the early Nazi period, who had been sent to prison or released, and were now drafted into the Wehrmacht in World War II. The German policy was don't ask, don't tell, and don't get caught. But homosexuality as a category did not make you ineligible for military service. So, in a sense, gay men suffered twice under this horrible regime. They were sent to prison, they often lost their careers, and then they were drafted into the Wehrmacht, perhaps to die on the bloody Eastern Front. But also in Phase 2, an increasingly large but minority of about 10% of the people brought before the courts are now sent to penitentiaries and also sent are put in permanent preventative detention. And increasingly, the government is also castrating homosexual men. So for a minority of men, under 175A, a minority of men within the gay community, a certain kind of homosexual in the eyes of the government, you could face the possibility of a long penitentiary term, the loss of your civil rights. You could be put in permanent preventative detention. And then, as we'll see in phase 3, you could be sent and would be sent to a concentration camp. So, as I said, at no point in modern Western culture has any government in a peacetime period treated homosexuals as the Nazi period did in the late 30s. And in no period did so many middle-class men find themselves in prison, a penitentiary, or a concentration camp. But in those peacetime years, few men died except for those who committed suicide, and certainly there were a number of those. And some men who ended up in penitentiaries ended up in horrible work details, or men who worked for a time in concentration camps and might die of disease. Tuberculosis was common among many prisoners. Dreadful treatment, long working hours, little food. But nothing compared to phase 3, the killing years. But again, our memories, or the memories of those survivors, have told us that, of course, thousands upon thousands of homosexuals landed in concentration camps and died there. What I've discovered is very complex. Not only was the concentration camp only one of many killing sites, there were a host of others where homosexuals died, and I want to run by and review for you the various ways that homosexual men ended up dying during World War II just because they were homosexual. First, the government reintroduced the death penalty in both the civilian and the military courts on the eve of World War II. And actually, phase 3 has 2 parts to it. In the last 2 years of the war, remember Stalingrad is January 1943, and from there, the German military is on the defensive and is losing the war. And in the last 2 years of the war, you get what I would call the demonization of the homosexual. And in fact, most men is not a large number. I don't know the total number. Perhaps a few hundred men are given the death penalty and executed by civilian or military courts, but primarily between 43 and 45. Secondly, increasingly the regime in the course of the war was concerned about wounded Wehrmacht troops, adequate hospital care, food, and a whole range of issues affecting the civilian population as well. And in September 1942, a secret agreement was signed between the Justice Ministry in Berlin and the SS Gestapo. And this agreement came about because prison and justice and SS officials concluded that there were too many unnecessary, unproductive people in Germany's penitentiaries. And as a result of this agreement, a whole range of categories of prisoners, primarily those in penitentiaries or in permanent preventative detention, would now be turned over to the Gestapo and the SS to be dispatched to concentration camps and destroyed Vernichtung durch Arbeit, destroyed by work. And so, in actual fact, it's primarily homosexuals who were in penitentiaries or in permanent preventive detention that die in concentration camps in the late months of 1942 and the early months of 1943, into the spring of 1943. Now, yes, there are some homosexuals who die every year. Anybody who's in a concentration camp has a chance of dying. But of course, most German homosexuals were dispatched to German concentration camps, not the great killing machine camps in Poland, Auschwitz, and all the rest. But there are others who died. Germans launched a euthanasia program. And in fact, the euthanasia program became central to the creation of machinery that was eventually to be used against the Jews. And many of the individuals who played a role in the euthanasia program ended up in the structure of the concentration camps, the death camps. In the first phase, some 70,000 severely mentally and physically retarded individuals in institutions were killed. They were injected with poison. And all Jews in mental institutions, especially children. There was a great world outcry. For the first time, the Catholic Church, which had signed a pact with the devil by signing a concordat with the Nazis not long after Hitler came to power, and had failed to speak out against the evils of the brutality of concentration camps that had been founded already in March of 1933, suddenly spoke out against euthanasia. So the Nazis simply went underground and continued to kill people using gas chambers, injections, starvation, and probably somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people were killed in the euthanasia program. And here, like the history of homosexuals, the history of people in mental institutions is a history of another one of the many victim groups of the regime. And in studying all of these and each of these, we understand the other methods of killing of the regime. In the government's eyes, people in mental institutions were useless eaters, they were unproductive, and they had to be destroyed. And so I'm the first to discover that of the many victim groups of the euthanasia program, old people, people bombed out of their homes and bewildered, even possibly severely wounded Wehrmacht soldiers, and individuals who were only retarded or had limited mental faculties, but were nonetheless able to work. So many of these individuals are killed secretly between 41 and 45. And so it was even against the law for the regime, its own law, to send someone to a mental institution just because they were homosexual. But many poor men ended up there, and many men died in the same way that all the other victims of the euthanasia program. So now we have three categories already of men who die, four in a sense if we count the suicides. Men who died primarily in 42 and 43, men who were given the death penalty and executed, men who died in the euthanasia program. Then the military became another killing site in a very unusual way. If you were sent to a civilian prison, you could eventually be paroled early if good behavior, just like in any court system. And especially in the late 30s and in the war years, when the regime was desperate for workers, homosexuals could and were often if they could work, be released early from prison, or they could be drafted into the Wehrmacht. The Nazis were incredibly fearful of a two-front war. They were engaged in a war of destruction against the Jews and the Bolsheviks, as they put it, against racially inferior people. And they knew that to keep this a fighting army, they had to have an incredibly brutal justice system. And so the military justice system of the Wehrmacht is one of the most brutal in the entire modern world. 50,000 at least, and with additional research rise to as high as 60,000 German soldiers are given the death penalty for various violations of military law. You can imagine what they would do to homosexuals. And some 30 to 35,000 of those men given the death penalty were actually executed. But the Wehrmacht had another maniacal weapon. Instead of giving people early parole for prison, first you were put in an incredibly brutal military prison, almost as bad as being in a concentration camp. Secondly, to get out early, to be paroled, or if you were given a long enough prison term, you were then, upon release from the military prison, put in a cannon fodder unit. And these cannon fodder units were then often used on the Eastern Front in the horrible, brutal conflict against Russia, the Soviet Union. And of course, among the many thousands of men who died in these cannon fodder units, there were many homosexuals who ended up there simply because they had been sent to prison, to a military prison for homosexuality. So many men die badly. Some men died in German penitentiaries late in the war through starvation. There was starvation in many German penitentiaries. So the picture is a horrible one and far more complex, as I indicated earlier. But now we have to ask the question, who died? Who were these men? And here again, these remarkable records that the Nazi regime collected allow us to figure that all out. So first off, of all the men who died, 90% are working class. Secondly, of all the men who died, the overwhelming majority of them were convicted under 175A. They are prostitutes, transvestites, habitual offenders, men who had sex with underage teenage boys. These are the men who died. But let's go back to the beginning and give some statistics. Between 1933 and 1945, 50,000 men are convicted of homosexuality by civilian and military courts. Of those, somewhere around 7,500 were convicted by military courts in World War II. So certainly the military, the German military, convicted a very high number of men for homosexuality as well. How many men served in a concentration camp? We will never know, and it's a question that perhaps is problematic, or the answer is problematic. Already in the spring of 1933, the new Nazi regime created a law that allowed the government, the police, to put individuals in protected custody. It was called Schutzhaft. So thousands of political opponents of the regime, homosexuals, asocial people, criminal elements, as defined by the regime, served from time to time in concentration camps. Most of those men in the peacetime years are eventually called before the courts and tried and sent to prison. But there were other categories. So yet another victim group of the regime were homeless people. And in the fall of 1937, again special Gestapo units, SS units, began raiding homeless shelters in the large cities of Germany. These men were picked up and put in concentration camps, never to be released. So there are an amazing number of victim groups of this evil regime. But also what's so significant then, in the fact that men convicted under 175A were a sexual minority, these are the men who also are the victim groups of the regime. So the regime further sort of categorized and dissected the pattern of homosexual behaviors, and it is working class men who were habitual offenders, who had sex with boys, who were male prostitutes, who were transvestites, who died. How many died? I believe somewhere between 10 and 15%. So of the 50,000 men convicted by the Nazi regime, approximately 5,000 to 7,000 men died in these various killing sites that I've outlined for you. It's a very striking picture. And as I indicated earlier, a far more complex view of the regime. In the spring of 1945, Hamburg is bombed to smithereens. It was firebombed like Tyson. The last element, the last action in the Nazi persecution of homosexuals are policemen with flashlights in this city without electricity, with thousands of burned and destroyed buildings, a city without water, a city without food, and these men in the special police units to ferret out homosexuality to homosexuals are standing in public toilets with flashlights, arresting homosexuals. It is sort of the final act of this regime. Do I need to stop at this moment? Obviously, I've covered a huge amount of ground. I wish I could have talked as well, I have to invite you back, I guess, about daily life of gay people, their bar life, their bathhouse life. It's also a fascinating story. Despite the prosecution, despite the threat of being arrested and thrown in prison, men went to bathhouses and bars and celebrated any way they could who they were. And that's also a remarkable part of the story of the survival of many gay men, despite the prosecution and persecution by this fascist regime, this fascist racist regime, who refused to give in. One homosexual, I'll end with this example, had been sent to prison 3 times between 1934 and 1941. He was released in 1941. The next day, he went to a gay bar in Hamburg. He was picked up. The policeman said to him, "Why? Why, after 3 prison terms, over 6 years in prison, did you go back to a gay bar?" And the man said to the policeman, "I wanted to be with other gay people." So there are a remarkable number of incredible heroes that we should celebrate as well in the Nazi period.